Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study, held at St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Jackson, Michigan. I will be your host, Todd Gale, as we walk our way through the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Hello, my friends. Thank you so much for joining us yet again. It's such an honor to walk this walk with you. Thank you for showing up every week, whether live or here on YouTube. I really do appreciate it. So we're in chapter 14 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. John the Baptizer was just beheaded. Now, remember, Matthew writes his gospel in 5 little books, 5 sections, like the 5 books of Moses. Chapter 14 begins the 4th book, and it's the same format as before. There's some narrative stories followed by a block of Jesus teaching. It's a sermon. Now, John the Baptist proves that the politicians of the world are opposed to the gospel. They're opposed to morality. It's dangerous business to belong to Jesus. Notice that John the Baptist is a man. He's human. He does something that infuriates the politicians, and so he dies. His ministry ends. He has fulfilled his purpose. Contrast that with his cousin Jesus. Undoubtedly, Jesus is utterly heartbroken by the death of his cousin. So we talked last time about the details of Herodias and Philip and Agrippa and Antipas, right? And Josephus, the historian, is the one that names this young girl that's dancing. He names her Salome. She's described as a girl, but more accurately, in the Greek text, she's a young girl. It's the same word that was used for the 12-year-old girl that Jesus raised from the dead back in chapter 9. So it's obvious that her mother set this up. The mother had planned for some time to get the head of John the Baptist. And here's an interesting little historical biblical note. These details of Herod Antipas's birthday party, how would we have known this? How would Matthew have heard about this? Well, there were 2 secret Christian disciples who had access to Antipas's court. Joanna, the wife of Herod Antipas's chief steward, Chuza. He's mentioned in Luke chapter 8. Joanna was a close Christian and helped fund the apostles' mission. And perhaps Herod Antipas's childhood friend, Manaen, who became a Christian, and he was listed among those who served as teachers and prophets at Antioch in Acts chapter 13. So between Joanna and Manaen, the story of what happened at this birthday party trickled down to Matthew. One really cool thing comes from the online Bible study, the Agape Bible study by Michelle Hunt. Matthew intentionally links the passion and death of Jesus with the passion and death of John. Herodias conspires to have John arrested and put to death. For Jesus, the chief priests and Pharisees conspire to have Jesus put to death. John was seized and bound. Jesus was seized and bound. The ruler Herod Antipas was responsible for making the decision to execute John. The ruler Pontius Pilate was responsible for making the decision to execute Jesus. Herod feared the crowds who held that John was a prophet. The chief priests and Pharisees feared the crowds. Herod's wife wanted her husband to kill John. Pilate's wife wanted her husband to free Jesus. Herod did not want to execute John, but was maneuvered by his wife, and he feared retracting his oath that was given in this public party. Pilate did not want to execute Jesus, but was maneuvered by the chief priest and feared that the crowds would riot. And John's disciples took his body away and buried it. Jesus's disciples took his body away and buried it. So in verse 13, Jesus goes off, it looks like off to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, up in the mountainous region. And when the multitudes heard it, they followed him. Both the religious and now the political leaders are opposed to Jesus and opposed to the truth. He's so popular with the multitudes, though. And when he sees this great multitude, he's going to be moved with compassion. And he says, you need to give them some food. You give them something to eat, he says, right? It's a setup. Jesus steps away to find peace and quiet and comfort with his Father. And instead, he finds a crowd eagerly demanding what he could give to them. Now, when we are emotional and exhausted and spent, do we tend to get a little resentful toward people? You know, I tend to feel very entitled. Hey, I deserve some time myself, right? Why do you have to make so many demands right now? Why are you invading my privacy? But this is not what Jesus does. This is why I am not God and he is, right? Jesus did this remarkable thing. He has compassion and mercy and heals people all the way into the evening. And then he's moved with compassion because they're hungry. The Greek word for compassion here is really expressive. It means his whole being is stirred down to its deepest depth. Literally means moved in the bowels, deep, deep inside. It is a felt compassion. He says, you give them something to eat. This is such a setup. He knows they don't have anything. He knows the apostles don't understand, and he knows what they're going to ask next. And they'll have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus says, bring them to me. And we have this beautiful miracle of the multiplication of bread. This is loaded, loaded, loaded. Now, this is the only miracle other than the resurrection that's reported by all 4 gospel writers. It's very important. And not only 4 times, but Matthew and Mark record this miracle twice. We're going to see this again in just the next chapter in Matthew's gospel. Once it's to a Jewish group, and once it appears to be a Gentile group. So 6 times in the gospels, this is repeated. There's obvious ties to the Eucharist, to communion, to the Mass. This feeding is a type of the Eucharist, right? It foreshadows what's going to happen. It points backward to the miracle feeding of the manna from heaven, right? And it points backward to the prophet Elijah, who has the ongoing miracle of flour and oil for the widow of Zarephath. It points backward to the prophet Elisha, who's multiplying 20 loaves of barley bread to feed 100 men. And it points forward to the Eucharist, the bread from heaven. That's the true food, the body of Jesus. And we have here 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, numbers in Matthew are always very, very important. 5 plus 2 is what? 7, the number of perfection, completion, the number of the covenant, right? The number of an oath. But even deeper than that, for the Jew, 5 was the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the law. And the 2 could very well represent the prophets and the writings. Together, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings make up what the Jews called the Tanakh, the Old Testament Bible. Like, Tanakh is a Jewish word that's an acronym. It's made from the first letter of those 3 divisions of the Jewish Bible. Torah, which is the instruction, the law, Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and Ketuvim, which are the writings, T and K. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The Jews say the Tanakh. So they would recognize the 5 and the 2. So the Jewish holy word is put into the hands of Jesus to be transformed into the new covenant. The old is turned into the new by God himself. Jesus says, bring them to me. Only God can do this work. This is much more than just a sign or a miracle. This represents everything that Jesus is about to do. The disciples do not have the grace to do this on their own. He commands the multitude to sit down in the grass. Eating could easily be done standing up. So the idea was that there's a bit of a banquet-like atmosphere. They're sharing a meal. They recline as they did at the Passover meals and at the Last Supper. And the other Gospels detail that they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. What are they doing? They're making little communities, little groups of people called out, little churches, little parishes. And then Jesus took, blessed, broke, and gave. I can't stress this enough. This is how we know this is connected to the Eucharist. We're not just stretching. Took, blessed, broke, gave. And these are the same four verbs used every time that the Bible tells us about the Last Supper. The same four verbs that St. Paul uses to talk about the institution of the Eucharist. And the same four verbs used on the road to Emmaus when the disciples break bread. And this is how they realize it's Jesus, because he took, blessed, broke, and gave bread. Clearly, to take, bless, break, give is tied to the Eucharist. And when Jesus blesses this, he blesses the Father for the food that he has, right? He may have prayed the familiar Jewish prayer that was prayed before most every meal. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Now, even though Jesus is the miracle worker, he includes his disciples. He does the multiplication. He brings forth the bread from heaven, and then he has the disciples distribute. He insisted on doing this miracle through the hands of the disciples. He could have done it directly, but he wanted to include them, just like at Mass. Small communities, churches, parishes are set up where Jesus performs an amazing miracle, but he has his apostles, his bishops, his priests give the bread of life to the multitudes. Now, no one knew where this bread actually came from, and Jesus showed us that God can provide out of resources that we can't see. Now, if you ever hear a homily or an explanation that says this miracle is really the miracle of sharing, that people had peanut butter sandwiches stuffed in their pockets, and out of love they started sharing with each other. If you ever hear a homily like that, please stand up, and I give you permission to throw the hymnal right at the head of the priest or the deacon, okay? Now I'm joking, not really. But that was super common. That kind of anti-supernatural, anti-Jesus, anti-divine, natural explanation. It was taught in the 60s and 70s in almost all of our seminaries. Nothing in this, nothing in the text, nothing in the response, nothing of the context of this even hints at anything other than a miracle from Jesus, especially when you consider it's completely tied to Eucharist. Peter Kreeft says that those theologians from that era took the miraculous, like the water turned to wine, and turns it back into plain old water again. It's not just anti-miraculous, it's anti-gospel. In the Vatican II document De Verbum, the Church clearly teaches that the Gospels teach us what Jesus truly did and truly said. We can trust them. Now the people gathered there, ate, and were filled. So not only was God's provision abundant, like the manna from heaven, where people could collect as much as they could eat, but there's a superabundance. There's more than is needed. How much more? 12 baskets. That's just some random number, right? Just 12. Well, 12 is enough to feed the 12 tribes of Israel. Or symbolically enough to feed the new Israel and the 12 apostles and those who follow them, right? In other words, a basket remains to feed each tribe. A basket remains to feed each of the New Testament apostles. A basket remains to feed all. Most commentators believe the 5,000 men suggests a total of 15 to 20,000 people. This is far greater than the manna from heaven. It's far greater than the miracle, the 20 barley loaves from the prophet Elisha. Okay, now in verse 22 to 27, Jesus walks on water and comforts his disciples again. This might seem like a bit of a repeat from chapter 8, when Jesus is in the boat with them and he calms the storm on the sea. But look at the master way that Matthew has set this up. In the first calming of the storm at sea, in that miracle, what's the question the disciples ask concerning Jesus and who he is? They say, "What sort of man is this, whom even the winds and the sea obey?" In this miracle, here, when he walks on water, they find the answer to that question. "You are truly the Son of God," they say. For some reason, Jesus felt it was really important for he and his followers to leave this area on the eastern coast, to leave it quickly. Maybe he was worried the people were going to ask for dessert or something. I don't know. So Jesus shoos away the disciples onto a boat. He stays and dismisses the crowd. Then he goes off finally to pray. Remember, that's what he originally went there for, and he was interrupted by the crowds. And notice that Jesus sends them right out into the storm. He literally leads them out when it's time for a storm. He knows the storm is coming, and he allows them to enter. He does the same for the storms in our lives, right? He leads us into the turmoil at times. Now, we mentioned before that the Sea of Galilee is well known for its sudden storms, and the storm that Jesus was in before, he was in the boat. This time he's not in the boat. It's the fourth watch of the night. That's somewhere between 3 a.m. and sunrise, 6 a.m. According to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, Jesus came to the disciples when the boat was in the middle of the sea, after they had exhausted themselves from rowing against the waves. And when he went to walk on the water, this must have been a total shock in every way. The water was a symbol of Gentiles, of the unknown, of turmoil, of chaos, also of a new creation. And all of this is under the control of Jesus, literally under his feet. It says, "Be of good cheer." Doesn't that sound rather British? I always think that sounds British. "It is I. Do not be afraid." Literally in the Greek, he says, "I am." Ego eimi. Ego eimi. It's the same way in Greek, if you were to read the book of Exodus in Greek, God says from the burning bush, "Ego eimi, I am." Now, Jesus says, put away your fear. There's usually two reasons we put away fear. One is the problem is not as bad as we think. We're exaggerating the danger. Or two is that even though there is a problem that could be real, there's a greater promise that's at hand. I forget the guy's name, but there's this bit of a modern prophet in Britain who says, God never gives you a problem without a promise attached. If God allows something bad in our lives, he only allows it because somehow, in some way, it's going to make us stronger or more compassionate or more humble. And that's exactly what he's doing here with this storm. But in this moment, his faith in Jesus is remarkable. He responded to Jesus. He got out of the boat. Notice he asks Jesus to call him out. He gives God permission. Do we give God permission to call us out of our boat? Do we give God permission to call us to go towards him? Peter wants to follow Jesus in this new demonstration of supernatural power, and it's the perfect illustration of living through storms in our life, asking Jesus to be with us, keeping our eyes on him while we walk through our storms. Faith, faith, trust, trust, right? This is just a perfect symbolic little story. Lord, save me, he says. It's a great prayer. It's short, to the point, deeply theological. We should pray this every single day. Most translations say, Lord, help me. Help me. I want you to remember that. That term's going to be repeated soon. Lord, help me. What a sight this must have been. Jesus and Peter walking hand in hand upon the sea. And then Jesus says, even though Peter had the faith to step out, he lost it for a moment. He momentarily took his eyes off Jesus. And Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith." That "oh, you of little faith" is just one word in the Greek. It's the only place this word is used anywhere in the entire Bible. Jesus is calling Peter a name. He's not just telling him he has little faith. He's not just scolding him. He's calling him a name. He's saying, "Oh, you of little faith." The word in Greek is oligopiste, something like that, which is very interesting. There may be some other times in the future where Jesus might call Peter a name. I want you to keep that in mind too. So why do we doubt? Jesus only asked the question once Peter was rescued, right? He doesn't throw it in his face when he's floundering. He doesn't say, "Why are you doubting?" He waits until he saves Peter, and then he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" At that point, it was entirely reasonable to ask that question, and it's entirely reasonable to ask us, why do we doubt? Fear, lack of faith, believing God cannot do something, or believing God can do something, but he won't do it for me. Why would he save me? I'm not important enough. I'm not good enough. Now, if you've never done Lectio Divina, where you kind of imagine the scene, you put yourself in that scene, you visualize it, and you ponder it and think it over and over, kind of like a movie that's taking place right in front of you. Imagine you're on that tumultuous sea, right? What's the storm of your life? Health or financial or bad relationships or violence or the craziness of our world? Like, are you Peter who's taking that step out, or are you one of the other 11 guys on the boat that are just watching, right? And when Jesus says, "Look at me," I really want you to think about the storm is going on all around us, and Jesus says, "Look at me, trust me, follow me, come to me. We can do this together. Keep your eyes on me." One person I know that was meditating on the scene saw that Jesus was tossing out life preservers and inflatables, and she walked across the water on that. I thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. But this scene is a real turning point in the Gospel of Matthew. With all the things they've seen, with all the miracles, all the hearing and all the teaching, this is a huge turning point. Not only do the apostles recognize he's the Son of God, which is a loaded image in and of itself. A son of God can be an angel or the covenant people or all Israelites or the prophets and the kings. They're sometimes called sons of God, but here they're saying something deeper. They don't only say you are the Son of God, but what's their response? Right? They don't just say it. What's their response? They worship. The apostles worship Jesus. Jews only believe in one God to worship. Clearly, in this moment, the pieces come together and they realize he's the very Son of Yahweh. He is God from God, right? Remember how Matthew 4 divides the gospel into the 5 parts that we talked about? In this fourth part, this fourth book, it's about the divinity of Jesus and his kingdom. And the narrative block here, what we see is he's got total control over nature. And Jesus feeds thousands of people. He's going to explain his passion coming up. We're going to see his glory in the transfiguration, right? He's demonstrating divinity in this fourth book. And the sermon that follows, the discourse, is all about how to live in this divine kingdom. So we end today verses 34 to 36. the when he crossed over to the other side of the lake, they're on the other side of Gennesaret, which is on the west coast, and they surround him and they beg him. He is touched, as we're touched, we're made perfectly well. Gennesaret is more like a region. It's not really a single town on the western shore of Galilee. It's kind of south of Capernaum. Evidently, when Jesus went out to the mountains to pray, he went way off to the eastern cliffs. Like that was the area where the pigs had leaped off to their deaths, right? And then they get in the water and there's the storm and the walking on the water. And then they move over to the western side. And it's the most populated area surrounding the lake. In fact, sometimes the lake is called the Sea of Gennesaret. They begged him that they might be healed, that they might only touch the hem of his garment, right? The Jews believed that when the Messiah came, even the hems of his garment would be healed. Maybe they had heard about the tassel on his cloak being touched by the woman earlier. The tassels, the tzitzi, right? The tzitziot on his cloak, those tassels that hang off the talit or the taliot, right? The prayer shawl, that all they had to do was touch those tassels and the Messiah's healing would come to them. Now, next time we meet, this is going to be utterly awesome as we turn the page to chapter 15. Oh, hold on to your bootstraps, right? This is just getting better and better. Thanks for joining me. Thanks, everyone. God bless. Thank you so much for walking the way through the Gospel of Matthew.